The word fragile conjures for us images of glass or bubbles or other things that easily break, but are not so easy or even impossible to put back together to their original state. And that pretty much describes the situation for millions of children around the world who live in places and situations where it's dangerous to be a child. In today's Changemakers Live, we're talking about these so called fragile contexts and emergencies, how they affect children, and how ordinary Canadians like you and me can help. My name is Lexi Rodrigo. I'm with the Strategic Communications team at World Vision Canada, and you're watching Changemakers Live. It's a monthly live stream where we demystify a social issue that affects the most vulnerable children in the world with the help of one of our experts at World Vision. And my colleague is here today, Karen Luce, to introduce us to our expert today. Hi, KL.
Hi, Lexi. We're looking forward to speaking with Helen Barclay-Hollands, who's a manager of our Fragile and Humanitarian Programs team at World Vision Canada. She leads program development and management for our work across fragile contexts and emergencies across the world, and has a lot of experience managing responses to complex humanitarian and emergency crises. He's worked in a lot of different countries, most notably the Democratic Republic of the Congo for 7 years, Haiti, Chad, Sudan, and Central African Republic. And we're so excited to learn about what does it take to address emergencies and fragile contexts behind the scenes. So welcome, Helen.
Hi, Helen.
We're really excited to have you here and to learn from your expertise on the show.
Yeah, if there's anyone who knows all about fragile contexts, it's Helen. How are you today?
Oh my gosh, what just happened?
Uh-oh, hang on, guys.
Hello.
Hey,
Young people.
Hey, Grace. I think you guys might be lost. Are you in the right meeting?
Yeah, Lexi, Grace and I are actually here to take over your Changemakers Live today with Helen, given that last week was International Youth Day, and the both of us represent World Vision Canada as youth ambassadors. So we thought there would be no better opportunity to facilitate this conversation and take over your roles for today.
You know what?
Sounds fair enough.
Take the floor. It's all yours.
Thanks, Kale. Thanks, Lexi. We'll see you soon. Awesome. Grace, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to the viewers first?
For sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Grace. I'm heading into second year at Western University. I'm also the advocacy coach on the World Vision Canada Youth Council. So super excited to be here today. Why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Grace. Hi, everybody. My name is Ashlyn Nguyen. I am also going to my second year of university studying biomedical sciences at York, and I represent World Vision as the chairperson of the National World Vision Canada Youth Council. Helen, it's lovely to get to meet you today and have a conversation about fragile contexts.
Great. All right, awesome. Great to be here.
Yeah, I think we will jump right into it. So our very first question for you today is, what does the term fragile context really mean? And what are some examples that you can give us today?
Sure, great question. So fragile contexts essentially are places where it's most dangerous to be a child. So these are places where there are political and social stresses, and that results in the extreme vulnerability of children to violence, exploitation, abuse, and neglect. In some fragile and conflict-affected contexts, it's because the government is unable or perhaps unwilling to ensure the basic rights and well-being of its population, and they lack the capacity to manage conflict without violence. And in extreme cases, it may be also because the state is non-existent, or perhaps they're actively involved in perpetrating violence against their population. Have to remember that fragility and conflict are not fixed, but move along a spectrum, and that it can affect entire countries, or perhaps be contained in smaller areas called pockets of fragility, and they could also cross borders to affect neighboring states. So some examples of fragile contexts where we work are Honduras, Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, so many others across the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that, Helen. And I know fragile contexts can be somewhat of a general term to many viewers who might be with us today who are not so well known in that space, but it's lovely to have a very clear explanation from your end. And you were able to provide us some examples of regions that are considered fragile contexts. And Grace and I are interested to know, what are some of the main challenges that occur in this area and in those regions around the world? Are you able to name and categorize a few that are most important to you?
Yeah, so one of the most shocking statistics I feel is that it's estimated that by 2030, 2/3 of the world's extreme poor will be found in fragile contexts, and the majority of whom will be children. So it's women, children, adolescents who are uniquely affected by conflict and fragility. So that can be things like gender-based violence, lack of adequate nutrition, even barriers just to getting basic health services. So they face rapid and unpredictable change. There's, as I mentioned, extreme levels of abuse and exploitation, and they're nearly 3 times more likely to be out of primary school than in other low-income countries. It also affects urban and rural areas. So we see hostilities and armed conflict are increasingly occurring in cities and towns and highly populated urban areas. And that just makes life so much worse for children in these environments. So yeah, just imagine if your home, your school, your playground became a battlefield as a result of urban warfare. That's the reality some of these children are living.
Yeah, those are some very terrifying thoughts. Like 2/3 of the world's extreme poor to be found in extreme or in fragile contexts. It sounds like a very dire situation. So, what places like are experiencing emergencies, and are these also considered fragile contexts?
Yeah, I think when a crisis happens, it brings a certain level of fragility to a context. So within World Vision, we rise after perhaps a natural disaster or an outbreak of conflict. And these are often short-term responses and can be in an otherwise stable context. But if the crisis continues over years, over months, and becomes protracted, this is when we look at other factors, as I mentioned earlier, that contribute to the fragility.
So, just as you explain, it seems like, again, there's this sort of spectrum of, what fragility looks like. It can be something short-term, it can be something long-term. And so I guess with this in mind and knowing the different challenges, as well as, what are the different needs of different areas and pockets of fragility, what sort of work do we do at World Vision to tackle these challenges? And maybe if you could elaborate and also speak on, like, how do we decide based off of the fragility level in different contexts how to cater our approach?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think, you've alluded it to a little bit in your question. These fragile contexts are incredibly complex places to work. And so from our experience, it's taught us that the best way to support children, families, communities in these contexts is through a multi-pronged strategy. So working with women, children, to make sure that they have the life-saving assistance, first of all, to survive some of those basic needs, also to rebuild and identify risks for the future so they can recover and adapt, and increase the resilience of these communities, the girls and boys within those communities, to build a better future where they can really thrive. So looking at different kinds of activities, there's activities around providing food, nutrition, water, education, protection, training. And the heart of our approach is making sure that we have agility, being able to shift from meeting those immediate needs to respond to actually addressing some of the root causes of what's really going on in these communities. And we also understand, as we've seen today in our call, things can change unpredictably, and they change constantly in these contexts. So our interventions are required to adapt based on those changes. As part of that, we plan for multiple scenarios and frequently update and adapt with all the incoming data that we get from these programs.
Yeah, so that is honestly like a lot of really good work that we can see that World Vision is doing. And I think that, there's a lot of, actions that are being implemented, but could you tell us maybe a little bit about maybe the types of impact that this world has had on the individuals, especially the youth, the children that are living in the world's most dangerous places?
Yeah, definitely. So our interventions, when we respond to the kind of basic needs to survive, is very much saving lives. And when we support a community to recover and build back better, we're helping them to weather the next storm, the next crisis that might come their way. And then we also walk alongside them to address some longer term goals for them and their families. And that's really helping them thrive. And this can make all the difference for children as they grow up in fragile contexts.
Mm-hmm. I love the part you mentioned, walking alongside them and considering this as a long-term project, and that, addressing fragility isn't just one simple project. Perhaps it doesn't have a clear timeline, but also, seeing how can we make lasting and sustainable impact in communities that were fragile as they continue to grow and build on top of themselves. So that's lovely to hear. So I know that KL and Lexi introduced you this earlier in this live stream and mentioned how you've lived in different parts of the world. And so I'm very curious about your personal experience. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about where around the world have you been working on the field, and what are some of the differences and similarities that you've noticed while working in these different places?
Yeah, great. I think, KL mentioned it in the introduction. I've worked in Democratic Republic of Congo, Chad, Central African Republic, Haiti. These contexts are different in so many ways. You have cultural differences, political differences, even climate. And they're hugely diverse within each context as well. So DRC, you have diamond mines on one side, and they also host refugee camps. So just hugely diverse even within the same country. One of the main similarities, though, across all of them is that it's women and children that are most affected. And they are often the most vulnerable in these contexts.
Right. So, yeah, it's awesome to hear that you've had so much work in different countries, and there's so many differences to navigate through in these different contexts. And so I guess, maybe what is one story during your experience in the field that has stuck with you, maybe during your field work in any of these countries?
Yeah, so when I worked in Democratic Republic of Congo, I was in the central province called Kasai, and I met a family who we were supporting as World Vision. So this family had fled conflict. An outbreak of conflict had happened in their village, in their community, and they'd fled. Their house had been burnt, and they fled into the forest. And they survived in the forest for over 2 weeks, just eating what they could, foraging, finding little bits of food that they could. And then eventually, when they felt it was safe enough to come out, they walked 5 days, 5 days to the provincial capital, which is where I met them. Unfortunately, one of their children fell sick on the way and didn't make it. So they arrived to the provincial capital seeking help. And so we were there as World Vision, were able to provide them food and meet some of their basic needs, but particularly for the children as well, we also provided them a safe space just to play, to be children, but also support to try and address some of the trauma, some of the things they'd seen and experienced, and also provide them education and access to education in that context, the months and weeks that they'd missed of school, not being able to access education. And actually, we have an education project that continues to this day in Kasai, in Democratic Republic of Congo.
Thank you so much for sharing that story with us. And I think what that really goes to show is the sort of impact that our work makes and how well-rounded and inclusive it is. You mentioned education as a consideration as well, that we like to provide to families who require support. And so, I think an all-inclusive lens like that is super important when dealing with fragile contexts to ensure that, we're able to mitigate as much as we can and help them in the most, holistic way as we can as well. So clearly throughout this live stream, you've demonstrated that you are so incredibly knowledgeable about the idea of fragile contexts. Of course, you are the expert in this field. So what motivates you to continue your work in this area? And yeah, what drives you to come to work every day?
I think, honestly, sometimes making a difference in a fragile context is really difficult. Sometimes just keeping things the same is actually success in fragile context. At least it didn't get worse, right? But I think for me, it's when I see, a real transformation. So perhaps a child on the brink of starvation who's malnourished, who then gets the nutrition they need, gets the support they need, the family gets the food they need. And then you see them running and laughing and just celebrating, and they tell you the stories and their hopes for the future, how they want to be a teacher one day. I think that for me is just, it just makes it all worth it.
Wow, that sounds absolutely amazing. Just being able to see the people that you've impacted, seeing them grow, seeing them have hope, that is something so inspiring, I think, to me and Ashlyn and everyone on the stream for sure. So I guess the next question, would be, how can we as Canadians be a part of this, right? Like, I am a youth, I'm someone who really wants to get involved. So how can we be involved in helping fragile contexts and emergencies?
Yeah, there's several different ways. Sometimes by giving, it can be of time, or giving perhaps financially. World Vision supports children all over the world in fragile contexts. They have a program called Raw Hope, and that's one of the ways that you can engage and learn more as well. But also by advocating for change and influencing government, influencing the key leaders to prioritize the urgent needs of those living in fragile contexts. And we've seen this recently in the support for the recent hunger crisis, and resources coming in and support from the government of Canada. And I think, youth leaders such as yourselves, you guys are key in this, and talking about these messages and mobilizing others to do the same.
Mm-hmm. Of course, yes. And I know that, myself and Grace, like we mentioned, youth leaders and all Canadians, across the country have, our own role. It's not something that we're so far and distant from. We have the ability to make impact. So that's lovely to know that we can also help you, as well as, the team at World Vision, to continue to provide support in these fragile contexts. Okay, Helen, that was fantastic. I think those are all the questions that Grace and I had for now. But we do want to turn it over to our viewers at home to see if they have any questions. And I believe we do have one here. And just going back to a conversation we had earlier in this live stream, I believe you mentioned that by 2030, 2/3 of the world's extreme poor will be found in fragile contexts, and the majority of which would be children. And so we have a question from Michelle at home asking, what can we do to prevent that bleak outcome in 2030? Is there something that we can be doing right now to ensure that that isn't the reality in 8 years' time?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Thanks, Michelle, for engaging on that. I think there's so many ways. How can we engage our leaders, government leaders? How can we engage others in our community to speak about these messages? I think, as I mentioned, we can hold government to a
Mm-hmm. That's I think opening up the conversation is super important when we're dealing with this issue, and also discussing it with decision makers, getting the government involved and having them stay accountable to this issue as well is really key in action moving forward. So I'll hand it over to Grace if you have any other questions.
Yeah, so we have another question from a viewer. And that is, so is it true that there are more disasters and emergencies today than in the past? Since we do see it a lot more in the news now. And there's social media and everything that is spreading out the news much more prominently than before, I guess.
Yeah, I think certainly we see more on the news. Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the advantage of having access to information globally, right? Although I still think that some are not so well covered by the media, and we shouldn't forget those crises and those contexts that perhaps the stories are not told. Like you have children who are suffering in Central African Republic, for example, and often that news doesn't often hit the mainstream media. So yes, there's more that we're seeing, but there's also other stories that we're not hearing as well. So I think we need to continue asking those questions about what's happening across the world and what's really going on for children living in these fragile contexts.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned that, the media, there's only so much that makes it to mainstream media, meaning that maybe, as, Canadians or just, viewers, how can we, or some of the strategies that you advise us to take on to make sure that we are maybe better educated on issues and emergencies around the world that may not be as, popular on, Canadian headlines. What can we do at home to be better educated in that sense?
I think, it's using a variety of different sources. You can look at where World Vision is active in terms of different country profiles. Those are all on our website where we're working. We're also looking at different sources of media, looking at there's mainstream media, but there's also different types of reporting. I often look at some of what Europe is reporting, what is being reported in kind of Australia and other places, not just North American news, just to see what else is hitting the news. Even news that's been reported in the Middle East, they have different priorities. So I think that also gives you a good view of what is out there and how we can hear some of those stories, like I mentioned.
Wow, that is honestly very good advice to be able to hear from new perspectives, especially around the world. That's very important to get a holistic view of everything that's happening in the world, for sure. So thank you, Helen. And moving on to another question. This is related to World Vision. So how do you think World Vision is able to respond so quickly to all of these emergencies that are happening? For example, like the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, one of the simple reasons is that we are there. We have so many field offices all across the world. So, I mean, taking Ukraine, for example, World Vision Romania has been there for a number of years. And when refugees spilled over the border, they were able to respond and assess their basic needs and mobilize their teams. We also have a global rapid response team, and they are able to deploy at a moment's notice and go out and support these field teams with additional technical capacity and resources as they need to.
Wow. Yeah. So that's awesome. And it's lovely to know that, World Vision has the resources and the capacity, because we are so, we are a prominent influence across the world, to be able to respond quickly to those emergencies, because emergencies, of course, are timely, and the support that we can give ultimately depend on how fast we're able to respond. That's fantastic that we have the resources and the capacity to do so. I actually have a follow-up question from our viewer, Michelle, who asked a previous question in the live stream. And she asks, how much is food insecurity, genocide, political upheaval, gender inequality, and education shortfalls as factors in what is happening to these groups all around the world?
Those are all, huge influencing factors. I think I mentioned earlier on when I was talking about how we define fragile contexts. It is all about those political, economic, social factors at play in a fragile context, and what impact that has on women and children in those communities. So yes, 100%, Michelle, you're totally right to call out those issues, because those all play a part in the complexity of what a fragile context is. And I think just by that list, you can see how challenging it is to operate in some of those contexts. You're coming up against some of these huge issues that we have to address and look at as we're designing our programming and supporting children.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to ask you, so right now in the work that we're doing, do you see that there's any room in the way that we've been handling fragile contexts for innovation? Where do you see our ability to respond to emergencies, the way that we approach fragile contexts developing over the next 5, 10, 20 years? Where do you see that there's room for growth, and what is realistic to expect for growth?
Yeah, I think 100% there's always room for innovation, finding new and different and better ways of doing things. Some of this is bringing in more technology to help us get better data, better real-time reporting. This is a lot of what we do when we work in fragile contexts, and particularly what something like Raw Hope that World Vision Canada has is looking to do, get that real-time information. But also, as we seek to grow our presence, that is ultimately the goal of World Vision, is to seek to reach those who are the most vulnerable, and to step into those places. So we're constantly looking for how we can improve and work alongside those communities. And that's where this agility and flexibility in our programming fits in terms of how we respond and how we work alongside those communities to understand their needs and be able to respond better.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you so much, Helen. You've shined so much light on fragile contexts. And even for me, being a World Vision ambassador, I'm sure I speak for Grace when I say this. Hearing it from an expert is so different than reading it on paper. And clearly you are the expert in this field. So it was lovely to have your insight. Grace, I'll pass it to you if you have any other thoughts to share.
No, absolutely. It was an absolute pleasure listening to you, Helen, hearing about your actual experiences in the ground, doing the work for World Vision. It's been an absolute inspiration, and I think I hope that a lot of Canadians will be inspired by your actions and conversation that we had today. So now I think we're about to run out of time, and it might be a good idea to get Alexi and Kale back on. What do you think, Ashlyn?
I agree. Let's bring them back for at least the closing. Hi, Lexi. Hi, Kale.
Hey.
Hi.
Wow. I enjoyed that very much. It's really nice to be able to watch this stream for a change.
100%.
Yeah, Ashlyn and Grace, you asked such excellent questions.
Thank you for the opportunity to take over. It was very fun stealing your positions for a day. And of course, it was an absolute pleasure to meet Helen and get to chat.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Honestly,
what did you take away from that?
The future is really bright if youth like Grace and Ashlyn are at the helm. So thank you guys for hosting such a thoughtful conversation with Helen. And Helen, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I found it so compelling to hear about just the sheer presence of World Vision across the world and how our teams on the field are just ready to jump at a moment's notice when it comes to fragile contexts and emergencies. I thought it was a really great tip to just stay informed about news from different parts of the world, to keep yourself having, a holistic perspective on different countries, and to keep learning about it, so we can figure out ways to advocate for the most vulnerable. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your stories. Hearing what compels you to come to work each day and to continue the hard work that you're doing was really inspiring.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me today, and thank you so much for your questions, Grace and Ashlyn. It was inspiring to see your engagement as well on the topic. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you to the viewers. If we could only cover so much in this half hour. If you want to go deeper into fragile contexts and emergencies, we invite you to go over to our website, where we have a lot of very informative articles on these and other issues, and you should see the links to some of those in the comments or the chat. And you know the drill. If this helped you to get just a little bit smarter about these social issues, then please like, share, and subscribe so that you'll be notified about our next Changemakers Live, where incidentally we'll be talking about education, because school is starting again soon. So with that, I say thank you and goodbye to everyone, and see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.